Today, we become legends.
So I recently played God of War 2018, and long story short, I was very impressed by the game and wanted to create a concept for Kratos in Smite. Full transparency here, God of War 2018 is the only game I've played in the series, and so this concept is based almost entirely off of mechanics and lore from that game. Sorry for any potential inaccuracies or missed opportunities from the previous games in the series. As always, I'm not a game designer or balance expert, and the numbers are there purely for display purposes to get a feel for how the god would be and aren't meant to be perfectly balanced. The ideas are what I want to showcase here, not how much I can fine tune the numbers. This god will never actually be in the game, so there's no point going that far into it. But without further ado, let's jump in with my concept for Kratos in Smite. So we're going to talk about his abilities in a bit of a strange order compared to how you normally would go about things. We're going to do the passive, then the ult, then the basic abilities, because the passive and the ult are kind of the core of the kit and they need to be explained together. So first up, the passive Armaments Master. Kratos fights with his choice of 3 different weapons. He selects a weapon at the start of the match and can change weapon using his ultimate ability. Each weapon applies a constant effect to his abilities. The Blades of Chaos makes abilities apply a burn that damages enemies over time and have a slightly increased range. These apply to all abilities. Using the Leviathan Axe, abilities apply a stacking slow to enemies hit and have a normal range, and the Guardian Shield, abilities daze enemies, a stacking debuff that causes enemies to deal reduced damage to Kratos, but they have a decreased range. The range increase and decrease is 5 units both ways, so you will have slightly decreased range on the Guardian Shield and slightly increased range on the Blades of Chaos, whereas the Leviathan Axe has the normal ability range. So this passive is really the core of my Kratos design and combines with his ultimate as the way to switch weapon. Each weapon provides a passive bonus to your abilities. In general, Blades of Chaos is pure damage, Guardian Shield is more defensive, and Leviathan Axe is somewhere in between. To be clear, these weapons won't change how the abilities actually work. He's not a stand switcher, they just apply small passive bonuses to every ability. Kratos would use his active weapon for basic attacks, but it's purely visual and wouldn't actually change the way the basic attacks work. This will only affect his abilities. For anyone who's not played God of War 2018, these are the 3 weapons that Kratos uses throughout the game, and from the get-go I really wanted to include weapon switching in a unique way. But let's move into his ultimate now, as that is the way he will be switching weapons. So the ultimate, Spartan Rage. Kratos enters Spartan Rage for 6 seconds, dropping his current weapon and brawling with his fists. His basic attacks during this time hit in a cone in front of him and will tremble enemies for a very short duration, while healing him for 30% of the damage dealt. Backpedal, strafe, and basic attack movement penalties are halved for the duration. During Spartan Rage, Kratos' abilities are replaced with armaments that decide his active weapon when the effect ends. Whichever armament is selected at the end of the duration will cast automatically and become his active weapon until he next uses Spartan Rage. Reactivating this ability will end the effect early and cast the selected armament. So the 3 armaments, we have the Blades of Chaos armament. Kratos imbues his Blades of Chaos with Spartan energy, spinning them over his head and dealing damage 3 times in progressively larger circles around him. The Leviathan Axe armaments, Kratos imbues his Frost Axe with Spartan energy, hurling it forwards with incredible force, dealing damage and stopping at the first god hit. He then recalls the axe, tearing out a piece of the enemy's soul, reducing their maximum health by 10% for 30 seconds. And finally, Guardian Shield armaments. Kratos imbues his Guardian Shield with Spartan energy, striking in a cone in front of him. Enemies hit, take damage, and receive a debuff that doubles their dazed stacks taken for 15 seconds. Kratos also gains a block stack for each enemy hit with this armament, up to 3. So yeah, I pretty much had to include Spartan Rage in the kit somewhere, and it only really made sense as an ultimate ability. Since Kratos uses no weapon but his fists when he goes Spartan Rage in God of War 2018, this was also a great way to thematically weave in the weapon switch mechanic. The way this would work is very similar to Merlin's stand selection on his ultimate, but with a much longer window. Once you ult, just press 1, 2 or 3 for Blades of Chaos, Leviathan Axe or Guardian Shield respectively, then at the end of the ultimate duration you will automatically perform that chosen armament attack and swap to that weapon. By default, your previous weapon will be selected. Cooldowns are shared and not reset when you change weapon, but given the duration of the ult, which is 6 seconds, you could drop your kit, ult, and then have a solid amount of your cooldowns already completed by the time the ult finishes and you change weapon. Also, it's not mentioned in the tooltip, but during Spartan Rage, Kratos will gain a small lunge on his basic attacks as he does in God of War 2018, and in a similar way to King Arthur in Smite. This would allow him to stick to enemies a bit more easily during the ultimate. So now we've got the core of the design down with the ultimate and passive doing the weapon switching thing. Let's move into his basic abilities. So first up we have Indomitable Will. Kratos lets out a mighty roar, damaging and deafening enemies around him for 2 seconds while gaining a unique buff to his basic attacks depending on his active weapon. This buff lasts 6 seconds. If the Blades of Chaos are your active weapon, Kratos gains physical lifesteal and his basic attacks cleave nearby enemies. For Leviathan Axe, Kratos' basic attacks apply a stacking attack speed slow to enemies hit and become ranged, with the third hit in his chain piercing all enemies. Which, by the way, his attack chain would be 1, 0.5, 1.5, so that big final 1.5 hit when you're using Indomitable Will with the Leviathan Axe will be a big hit through like the whole minion wave, for example. And finally, with Guardian Shield, Kratos' basic attacks also apply daze to enemies hit. Normally it's only abilities that do this, and they deal additional damage for each stack of daze on the target. So I mentioned before that your weapon won't change your basic attacks, but that's just for the passive. Indomitable Will does change your basic attacks quite a bit depending on your active weapon, but only for 6 seconds. I experimented with putting basic attack effects as permanent on the passive, but it felt a little bit too much, so I made them their own ability and temporary. This allowed for some more crazy effects without completely breaking the game if you always had them. Moving on to the second ability though, Double Trouble, this is going to be his main wave clear ability. Kratos slams his weapon into the ground, dealing damage and stunning enemies hit. Atreus then leaps from his back with a follow-up arrow shot. Atreus uses dazing arrows which apply an additional stack of daze if Kratos is using the Guardian Shield, otherwise he uses electric arrows that chain 50% of the damage dealt to nearby enemies. So this ability is pretty simple as the kit was already getting very complex with the 3 different weapons. This is his basic wave clear tool as I said, since you can hit the melees with the initial slam and then the full wave with the follow-up arrow shot for efficient clear. Keep in mind that your weapon will apply a passive burn, passive slow, or stacks of daze only on the initial slam and not on the arrow shot afterwards because that's Atreus doing it, not Kratos himself. However, the arrow shot will apply daze if you have the Guardian Shield as your active weapon for some extra synergy there, and a nod to the 2 different arrow types that Atreus uses in the game. And finally, as with basically every assassin in the game, he needed some kind of movement, so the third ability is Ghost of Sparta. Kratos ascends Yggdrasil to travel between realms, self-banishing for a maximum of 4 seconds and becoming invisible to enemies. At the end of the timer or on reactivation and cancelling the ability, Kratos leaps down, dealing a sweeping weapon attack around him that cripples enemies. So yes, this is a reference to the fast travel in God of War 2018, but would function as a self-banish that then allows you to walk freely above the battlefield for 4 seconds before choosing a landing spot. You are invisible to enemies while walking on the branches of Yggdrasil, but of course your teammates can still see you, which can make for a nice surprise engage or way to escape a fight. The ability also cripples on hit to allow follow-ups from Double Trouble or Indomitable Will and then chasing down with basic attacks without the enemy jumping away. But that's all I've got for my Kratos God concept. What do you think of him? I feel like his different weapons would alter his playstyle enough to be impactful, but aren't so crazy that he's basically a 3-part stance switcher. You might lean towards a certain weapon for laning and a different one for team fights. You can also get 2 different weapons in one team fight if you want to by casting your whole kit, then ulting to change weapon. I feel like he will potentially be viable in a few different roles because of the whole weapon switching thing, but the 2 I had in mind when designing him were solo and jungle. A more bruiser solo lane variant of Kratos might use the shield more often for the damage reduction on daze and block stacks from the armament after ulting. While jungle, probably his main role, would use Blades of Chaos a lot more for the lifesteal, bleed and extended range on his abilities. Leviathan Axe I feel is more of a utility based weapon that you might swap to in the right situation, but probably wouldn't be your main weapon for laning or jungle clear, unless I guess you're trying to meme him into a ADC with the ranged basic attacks from Indomitable Will. But anyway, that's it from me. Don't forget to drop a like before you leave if you enjoyed the concept and let me know who I should create next, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out you nerds.